Namaskar. Good morning, everybody. Thank you all for coming to this meeting. And thank you, Prakhyat Bhai, for this most beautiful song. But he has made all three lectures redundant with this one song. Yeah. Okay. Last month, we began with the theme of approaching God. How to approach God. As we heard, we can only approach God through spiritual practice, spiritual discipline. There is no other way. There are many different types of spiritual disciplines, major and minor, that are suited to different aptitudes and different levels of competence. As we heard, among the major disciplines, prayer, worship, and meditation are the three most important ones, especially in our Hindu tradition. All three are very closely related. They supplement and complement each other. That is why we see that they are often practiced simultaneously. In our last session, we studied the first part of the subject, approaching God through prayer. Today we take up for discussion the second part, approaching God through worship, or worship as a spiritual discipline. We'll try to know something about the fundamental principles underlying it, and also learn how we can practice it in our daily lives in various ways. Worship basically means offering everything to God. Almost all of us here have heard about that great devotional scripture, the Bhagavata. There we read, what is most covetable to people in general, and whatever is especially dear to yourself, that should be offered to God. That offering produces inexhaustible results. I'll say it once again. What is most covetable to people in general, and whatever is especially dear to yourself, that should be offered to God. That offering produces inexhaustible results. Yadyadishtatamam loke yachchati priyamatmanah tattan nivedayen mahyam tadanantyaya kalpate. That is the Bhagavata verse. We worship God with various things that we get from Him. We don't create fire or water, or flowers and fruits. Nature gives us these things, but the way we use them makes the difference. The more we take things for our own use, the narrower and more clouded our soul becomes. From the spiritual point of view, it is a selfish misappropriation of God's gifts. This is what also the Bhagavad Gita says. The devotee offers everything that comes to them to the Lord. And what is the result? The soul expands. By offering to God what He gives us, we ourselves are purified. Our soul grows. Anything can be offered to God. Our food, our new dress, our new car, our new television set, everything that we get. Before we start using it, we should first offer it to the Lord and then accept that as a sacramental thing and use it with care. This purifies the mind and elevates it. As we heard the other day, God is the greatest purifier. Anything connected with Him becomes holy, sacred. By handling sanctified things, we sanctify ourselves, we purify ourselves. Just to give you an example, in all our ashrams, garden produce and new publications are first sent to the shrine. They are used in the kitchen or put in circulation only after they are offered to Sri Ramakrishna in the temple. This is a good practice which all of you can do in your homes with everything that you buy and use. The act in itself may not appear great, but just think of it. When hundreds of actions of this kind, hundreds of little offerings to the divine are made, the cumulative effect of all these after a number of years is something really tremendous. Gradually, over years, we will have developed a spirit of surrender and detachment. In fact, there is no other way to get this. Purity and surrender don't come all of a sudden. They are the accumulated result of thousands of little actions. So, by worship, we mean not just the external act of worship, but more importantly, the cultivation of the worshipful attitude, an attitude of offering everything to God. Because human nature is self-centered, this attitude of giving develops only slowly. The natural tendency of the mind is always to ask and get, to be always, to remain as the receiver. That is why probably prayer, asking, comes first. It is only when, as a result of prayer, the soul starts receiving divine grace, grace in the form of spiritual virtues, purity, faith, love, and devotion. It is only then that the soul can truly offer everything, including itself, to the divine. Which implies that worship, as a spiritual discipline, needs a certain degree of prior qualification and inner training. It is because we generally take up worship without first acquiring this competence that it fails to lead us forward on the spiritual path. Especially in the case of professional priests who perform ritualistic worship in churches and temples. This is why the saying, "nearer to church and farther from God," is largely true. Even years of worship doesn't seem to lead them Godward. Anyhow, we were talking about offering everything to God and then using it ourselves. That is no doubt good. But what is the test of our sincerity? How do we know that we are prepared to give up everything for God's sake? The only test is our willingness, our readiness to sacrifice. We should be ready to sacrifice everything for the divine. Let us bear in mind that worship is a very intimate kind of I-thou relationship between us and God, which is mainly characterized by sacrifice, tyaga. There can be no worship without sacrifice. And sacrifice is not just giving, it implies two things. One is giving without expectation of return. Whatever we offer in worship must be for love and not for trade. Secondly, sacrifice means self-denial. It must entail some loss to the ego, so to say. It is not what we offer that matters, but how we offer it. As Krishna says in the Gita, God is pleased even with a little leaf, or a flower, or a fruit, or just a droplet of water, if it is offered with love. Bhakti upahritam. It brings to mind the Bible story of the widow's mite. One day, when Jesus was teaching the people at the temple in Jerusalem, he sits down opposite the place where the offerings were put. There he watches the crowd putting their money and other gifts into the temple treasury. Many rich people throw in large amounts. Then a poor widow comes and puts in 2 very small copper coins, worth probably not more than a few cents. Calling his disciples to him, Jesus says, "Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put more into the treasury than all the others. They all gave their gifts out of their wealth, but she, out of her poverty, put in everything, all that she had to live on." That is sacrifice. That is tyaga. From a spiritual point of view, the basic idea behind sacrifice is selflessness. What is the greatest obstacle to spiritual progress? Selfishness. So, giving up selfishness is the true spirit of sacrifice. And what is the cause of selfishness? It is the ego. When the ancient rishis inquired into the nature of the ego, it led them to the discovery that all individual selves are parts of one supreme spirit who dwells in all beings. Later on, the bhakti teachers developed this idea. They taught that the best way to get rid of the ego and its selfishness is to surrender oneself to the will of the Supreme Being, or God. Now, the very word sacrifice implies a certain amount of suffering or deprivation, you could say. So it has meaning only to a person who regards worldly goods as real and valuable. That is to say, to a worldly person. But a person who looks upon the world as unreal and impermanent, to a spiritual aspirant, who is therefore prepared to give up the world for the sake of God, they don't feel that giving up is a sacrifice. For such people, for spiritual aspirants, the idea of self-surrender, self-offering has greater appeal. So we see that over time, as ideas of spirituality, that is, jnana, bhakti, vairagya, when these ideas began to spread, the concept of sacrifice slowly gave way to that of self-surrender to God. Whatever it is, what I'm trying to say is the idea of giving is common to both sacrifice and surrender. And it has always been a basic characteristic of worship. For us, the best way of cultivating this idea of sacrifice is through service. Service naturally involves some kind of sacrifice. We have to sacrifice our time. We have to sacrifice our energy, our comforts for the service of those who are sick, ignorant, or suffering. We have to look upon them as temples of God. In serving them, we are worshipping the Lord Himself. Offering flowers and incense is not the only form of worship. Through this higher form of worship, we develop a wider outlook. Swami Vivekananda said, at the back of our finite existence, our limited consciousness, there is one undivided, limitless being manifesting Himself through every living creature. Serving Him in every living being is the highest worship. If we can do this form of worship, why remain satisfied with the lower forms? So, that is the range the spiritual discipline of worship covers. From worshipping God with material objects to serving Him in all living beings. Apart from these, there is another kind of worship, mental worship. It is actually a higher form of worship compared to external ritual worship. In Sanskrit, it is called Upasana, which literally means to sit near. That is to say, to sit near the deity. In practice, it means contemplation or meditation on God. This kind of mental worship is the principal spiritual practice in the dualistic systems of Vedanta. Let us not forget that Vedanta includes a number of dualistic schools of thought also, not just Advaita Vedanta. These dualistic systems regard God and the individual self as two separate entities. The worshipper tries to bring about the contact of these two in varying degrees of intimacy, but the distinction between them is never totally lost. First, the aspirant remains as the seeker, and God is the object of their search. Then they become servants of God, who is their master. Then they are friends of God, and God is their companion. Later, they become like parents of God, and God is their child. And lastly, the devotee thinks of themselves as lovers of God, and He is their beloved. In highly advanced stages, the worshippers regard themselves and all living beings as pure souls, and God as the soul of their souls. All these devotional attitudes progressively serve as stepping stones to the path of non-dualism. However, that is still far away from the vast majority of us. Most of us need some kind of worshipful symbols. Otherwise, our mind wanders. So, in order to make concentration easier, some holy objects are selected. This kind of worship, in which an object is taken as a symbol, a representation of God, is a common practice. It is common among devotees who worship the personal God, but also among seekers who contemplate the impersonal Absolute. Here we need to keep in mind that worship is not of the symbol, but through the symbol. Because everything has emerged from God, any object can, in a way, become a symbol of God. But all religious traditions have held certain symbols as specially sacred. Worship of the sun and fire was once widely prevalent all over the world. But we must try to see beyond mere sun and fire in our worship and try to find the eternal light itself. As I said, we must always bear in mind that these are only symbols and not God Himself. At best, they can be thought of as manifestations of God. Enlightened souls don't need any symbols. They see the divine spirit inside and outside. Advanced souls don't care for outside symbols. They meditate on God as dwelling in their own hearts. But ordinary people like us, who are not spiritually mature, we can only begin our spiritual life by worshipping God with the help of an image. It is like something like a peg to hang our faith on. There are a number of Sanskrit verses that mention different types of worship and different levels of progress in worship. According to one well-known tantric verse, worshipping an idol or image is the first step. Higher than that is repetition of a holy name and singing of divine glories. Silent contemplation of God is even higher. But the best is to know that I am He. In the original Sanskrit, Prathama Pratima Puja Japastotradi Madhyama Uttama Manasi Puja Soham Pujottamottama. With the aim of achieving the union of Atman with Brahman, certain aspirants practice a special method of worship called Upasana, trying to grasp the self. In this method of worship, the worshipper identifies, not equates, but identifies themselves with the object of their worship and meditates on their own self. The object of worship may be any particular deity or the personal God, Ishvara, or even the impersonal absolute. During the time of worship, the worshipper imagines that they and the object of worship are non-different. That is to say, that they are both one and the same. This kind of meditation on the identity, not similarity, but identity between the worshipper and the worshipped, this leads to the realization of the one without a second. This is the aim of Upasana. But this method is not easy. Without the right temperament, without the necessary qualifications, it is very difficult to practice this kind of worship successfully. That is why scriptures advise worship with the help of some appropriate symbol. To repeat, God is worshipped not as the symbol, but through the symbol. The aim is to see in the limited symbol the presence of the limitless spirit which transcends all names and forms. The symbol is only a substitute or a suggestion of the all-pervading God. So let us take a deeper look at this subject of worship through symbols in greater detail. The symbol could be internal, like the mind or the very soul of the worshipper. Or they could be external, like space, the sun, fire. Or a sound symbol, like Om. This is what we find in the Vedas and Upanishads. But those who find these symbols too abstract or too subtle can begin with the use of a concrete image, but always keeping in mind that the image is only a symbol of God or the Supreme Spirit. Because if it represents anything lesser, anything less than God, say an angel or a saint, that worship doesn't lead to liberation. But if the symbol stands for the one God, then it will bring both devotion and liberation. The idea is God is one, but his aspects are many. Because it is not possible for us to worship him in all his fullness and glory, we take up some aspect or other of the Lord. But even in order to approach him through any of his personal aspects, we need the help of different symbols, mental, verbal, or material. As I said, the symbol is not the reality, it is only a means of remembering God through the association of ideas. In the beginning of our spiritual life, we may take the help of material symbols, say a picture or an idol. As we progress, we may dispense with material aid and make use of sound symbols to call up the same divine idea. Advancing further, we may do away with both material and sound symbols and proceed with purely mental worship on the plane of thought, silently and quietly. And even this we can give up when, at the very thought of the divine, we are able to lose our little individual self completely in the great universal self. That's a far cry, though. As it is now, our vision is limited, and all that we see is colored by this limitation. What we see is not light as it is, but only a reflection, and that too within a certain range. Our understanding is also circumscribed. We can't realize the ultimate reality directly. What we know, we can only know through the mind, through its waves and images. So we are bound to the domain of symbols and ideas which point to the truth, but at the same time hide it. Then there are symbols and symbols, real ones and false ones. The mirage looks like water, but it is a deceptive appearance which has nothing to do with water. But the wave is a true symbol of the ocean because it rises out of it, is always in touch with it, and subsides into it. And like the ocean, it is also made up of the same substance, water. Then there are lower and higher symbols, gross ones and subtle ones. Between the reality and its expression, a number of symbolic processes intervene within the mind. These deep mysteries were discovered and understood by the mystics. They have seen through all the intervening layers and penetrated deep into the very heart of reality, and they have left behind their footprints for less qualified aspirants like us to follow. If we make use of those symbols and divine forms in our worship and meditation, which have come down to us from the Vedic times to the present day, we may realize God in some aspect or other. So this whole science of worship is quite a complex one. Every image and symbol is well conceived and thoroughly researched. Every procedure, physical or mental, is executed exactly according to according to injunctions, because everything is designed for spiritual development, for spiritual progress. But sadly, people give up rituals before they are spiritually advanced enough. It is very wrong, just as giving up image worship before having outgrown it is wrong. Worship is not an inferior discipline after all. For most people, worship of some image, physical or mental, is very necessary if they really wish to grow and not merely to theorize. But then, if we find that all our life we remain worshipping only images, there is something seriously wrong. We need to always check whether, as a result of practice, we are making spiritual progress or not. External worship may be useful to us in the beginning, and some people are great ritualists and derive immense joy from it. But we should not spend all our life just doing external worship. External worship is meant to lead us to internal worship sooner or later. We need not persist in trying to see God outside, but try to seek Him who dwells eternally in our own hearts. That is not to say that everyone should give up worshipping images as quickly as possible. The important thing is to seek the divine in one's own soul, in the depths of one's own heart. Spiritual life is just like a staircase. We must climb up step by step. We must first find out where we are, because otherwise progress is not possible. We may begin with external worship, but we should also become more and more introspective and see God in His real abode, that is to say, in our own souls. There is another way of worshipping God. Instead of worshipping Him in the elements, as we do in ritualistic worship, in fire, water, earth, and so on, or through abstract symbols, or in other outer objects, we can worship Him in the image of the human body itself. Then our body itself becomes the temple and the heart the inner shrine. By worshipping God in the microcosm, we ultimately perceive Him in the macrocosm, because, as Swami Vivekananda said, the microcosm is only a miniature of the macrocosm. But the danger here is, if instead of the divine principle, the human personality becomes more important, then the worship loses all its spiritual value. That is the danger. In order to benefit by this method, it is very necessary that we cultivate the right mood and attitude. And this is where we see the effectiveness of tantric worship. The tantric method of worship is based on Advaitic principles and yogic techniques. Their worship, the tantric worship procedures show that by controlling the lower planes of thinking, we can actualize the spiritual possibilities in us in a graded way. The tantrics associate the 6 yogic centers along the spinal cord with different planes of thinking, with different planes of consciousness. These centers are like points of contact between the self and the various planes of consciousness. The task of raising consciousness from one center to another up to the highest plane is a most difficult one. But every aspirant who wants to follow the path of worship should try to raise the focus of their consciousness at least to the center in the region of the heart. This center has been likened to a sacred inner space, the Harakasha in the Vedas. But those who are not drawn to any particular symbol or image can meditate in some higher center on the light of consciousness. And those who can't do without a form can meditate on the luminous form of their chosen deity. But I think this discussion is now leading to a region where worship and meditation overlap. So let me return to our present topic. Worship is done in three forms: physical, verbal, and mental. Formal worship, prayer, and contemplation. Of these, the first one, consisting of rituals and ceremonies according to scriptural rules, this has almost fallen out of use in the average person's life. This is mainly due to the inconveniences of modern social life, like stress and the absence of leisure. That is why verbal worship has become very relevant in the present age. This is the best type suited to our times. Verbal worship consists of repetition of God's name and the singing of His praises and glories. In actual practice, however, it includes two other things: visualization of God's luminous form and contemplation of His divine attributes. Along with chanting God's sacred name, we imagine God's form as blissful, living, and above all, real, and dwell on His godly qualities like love, compassion, purity, and power. All three should go hand in hand because together they play a very significant role in the beginning of our spiritual life. In fact, people generally find this three-way worship easier and more effective. When it is done with intense aspiration, this in itself becomes a form of higher worship. Actually, this combination of repetition, visualization, and contemplation, this should be done in a spirit of mystic worship. It is only when this spirit is lost that it all becomes mechanical and lifeless. Too often we forget this central point. The attitude of reverence and adoration, the attitude of love and devotion, of humility and surrender must always be present. It is these that make this form of worship an effective spiritual discipline. No doubt, even mechanical repetition of a mantra has some value because the divine name itself has its own intrinsic power. But when it is done with intense aspiration as a form of worship, our entire being becomes radically transformed. This is the secret of success in this form of worship. So, to summarize what we have discussed until now, the word worship in Vedanta means something different from what we hear about it in other traditions. It means Upasana, approaching God step by step until we become one with Him. Upasana means mystic worship. We begin with concrete images, then move on to mental images and the repetition of divine names, and finally try to realize the union of the individual self with the Supreme Spirit. Along the way, through a graded course of spiritual disciplines, our body consciousness and egotism are progressively reduced, and the potential divinity of our soul becomes more and more manifest. In this Godward journey, the soul passes through several stages and overcomes many obstacles until at last it reaches perfection. However, one vital point we have to bear in mind: our focus should be more on the soul than on the body, and more on God than on the soul. The body has to be looked upon only as the dwelling house of the soul, and the soul itself has to be looked upon as the seat of God. Then we must try to identify ourselves with the soul, and then try to establish contact with God, who is the soul of our soul. If we don't emphasize this point, then our whole life will become a kind of body worship. People who look down upon the worship of a personal God or regard it as a kind of idolatry should know that it is far better than their worship of their own bodies. Devotees, bhaktas, on the other hand, see the divine immanent in themselves and in all living beings. Their whole life thus becomes a worship of the divine spirit, and they enjoy profound peace and fulfillment. So now we get an idea how much there is to know about this everyday ritual called worship. How scientific it all is, how much psychology there is in it. If anybody is interested in knowing more about the subject, as I mentioned last month also, please look up revered Bhajananandaji's series of articles in Prabuddha Bharata magazine on prayer, worship, and meditation as spiritual disciplines. Before we close today's discourse, I'd like to say a few words specifically on the question of what worship does for us. Why should we practice this spiritual discipline of worship at all? In other words, what are the functions of worship? First of all, as a spiritual discipline, its primary function is to prepare the mind for higher meditation. In Patanjali's yoga, dhyana is only the third stage in the process of concentration. The earlier two are pratyahara and dharana. So we could say prayer is the bhakta's way of practicing pratyahara, that is, withdrawing the outgoing mind. In the same way, worship is the bhakta's way of practicing dharana, that is, fixing the mind on God or at a center of consciousness. The mind that is detached through prayer is focused on a divine form through worship. When the mind is so fixed, our thoughts flow Godward. And when this process lasts longer, that becomes dhyana, meditation. So worship gives a good training in holding the mind on a higher plane. This is one of the main aims of tantric worship. Then secondly, worship deepens our I-thou relationship with God. This I-thou relationship can also be established through prayer and meditation, of course. But worship creates a very special relationship with God because it is characterized by loving service and self-surrender, which is said to please God greatly. Sri Ramakrishna said, God's grace is necessary to practice meditation. And this grace comes through prayer and worship. And thirdly, worship is about giving. It is the devotee's way of practicing renunciation, vairagya. Service to others done as worship is as purifying, as liberating as renunciation. In spiritual life, what is important is not how many things we have given up, but how much ego we have given up. It is the ego that blocks the channel of communication with God, who dwells in all living beings. It is the ego that alienates us from God. Worship reduces the ego and clears the channel for the free flow of divine grace. So, training the mind, purifying it, and establishing a close personal relationship with God, these are the primary functions of worship. But its ultimate purpose is the direct experience of God, to see God. All worship is based on this basic belief and hope that we can see and be with God through worship. The first 4 years of Sri Ramakrishna's sadhana is a glorious example of that. All set, the main purpose of worship is to reduce egotism and establish an everlasting relationship with God. This can be done through any one or more of the methods we just heard about. It doesn't matter which. Once this is accomplished, the life of the devotee itself becomes one unbroken worship of the divine. Thank you. Now I have a couple of announcements. Next Sunday, Revered Swami Atmajnanandaji is going to speak on for one's own liberation and the welfare of the world, or only the first part. Okay, yeah. He has already introduced the topic last month. So next Sunday, it is Maharaj's speech. And on Saturday, 2nd March, that evening we have a music concert. I repeat, 2nd March, Saturday, at 7:30 in the evening, we have a music concert by Sri Ritam Sarkar on classical slide guitar. Ritam Sarkar on classical slide guitar and Sri Devu Nayak on the tabla. And on 8th March, again at 7:30 in the evening, 7:30 p.m., 8th March, we'll be celebrating Shivaratri with special puja. And finally, on 10th March, that will be on a Sunday, 10th March, we'll be having Bhagavan Sri Ramakrishna's birthday puja.
And we moved Ramadan from the first Saturday to the second Saturday of the month because of the music concert.
Yeah, usually we used to have Ekadashi on the first Saturday of the month. This will be moved to the next second Saturday. All right. Thank you very much. Thanks for bearing with me. Yeah, please, we can all go down to the basement and have some refreshments. Thank you.